Hi, everyone. Welcome to the ARC's National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability webinar. My name is Catherine Walker, and I'll serve as today's facilitator. Before we begin our presentation, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping rules, especially for those of you that are new to WebEx. Because there are so many of you, all participants are currently in listen-only mode. At any time during the presentation, if you need assistance, you can post a question into the chat box on the side of your screen, and we'll be happy to assist you. At the end of the session, there will be a time for questions. You can either post questions to the Q&A section or raise your hand using the icon at the bottom of the participants window, and we'll call on people. You can also email questions to nccjdinfo@thearc.org. If we don't get to your question during the presentation, we'll be sure to follow up with you afterwards. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website. We will send you an email letting you know when it's available. During the presentation, you'll be asked to answer a few questions via polls. These poll questions help us document your involvement for our funders, so please participate. The webinar today is the fourth of a series of monthly webinars sponsored by NCCJD and features Dr. Rosemary Hughes and Sgt. Michael Sullivan. We have one final request before we begin. You will receive a session evaluation immediately following this webinar. Please take the 5 minutes to complete and submit this to us. This webinar is supported with funding from the United States Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Assistance, and it is very important for the ARC and DOJ to have a good understanding of what you learned and how you plan to use the information. Thank you for your attendance and participation. Please welcome Dr. Hughes and Sgt. Sullivan. Oh, Dr. Hughes, I think you have to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Catherine. And good morning. And greetings from Montana. This is Rosemary Hughes from the University of Montana in Missoula. My co-presenter today, as Catherine said, is retired Sgt. Michael Sullivan. We are honored to have this opportunity today to share our work and that of our colleagues on the crime victimization of people with disabilities and deaf people. For purposes of accessibility, we will read the information and describe the images on our slides. Much of the information presented today was generated by a large project, a parent project, called the Identification and Reporting of Violence by Persons with Disabilities. It was a 5-year research project funded by the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research of the U.S. Department of Education. The award was made to Oregon Health and Science University, and it was a collaboration among Oregon Health and Science University, Portland State University, Baylor College of Medicine, and the University of Montana. The PI, the principal investigator, was Dr. Lori Powers until she relocated to Portland State University, at which time Dr. Marianne Curry assumed the role of principal investigator. We have a list of all of our team members at the very end of this slide presentation. So this project involved 3 major studies. First, the National Crime Reporting Survey, which involved a survey of 133 police departments across the country. And although we're not going into detail on that study today, we did find out that most of those departments did not have specific protocol and procedures for responding to people with disabilities who were crime victims. The second study was the Violence Screening, Safety, and Reporting Study. And this study was an evaluation of a computerized abuse and safety assessment intervention for 305 women with disabilities. And the third one, the Crime Reporting Facilitators and Barriers Study, is the study that we will focus on today. We'll describe in quite a bit of detail later on in the presentation. So our learning objectives for today's webinar First, to review the background information on crime reporting by people with disabilities. Secondly, to discuss findings from 2 focus group studies on crime reporting by people with disabilities and deaf people. And to discuss recommendations for increasing the reporting of crime by people with disabilities. So by way of background, the first thing that I'd like to mention here is on this slide, there's a photo of a woman using a wheelchair looking out the window with a threatening figure in the background. And according to the National Sheriff's Association, perpetrators specifically target this population under the assumption that victims will be unable to escape or report the crime. And that statement is supported by a great deal of research. Now here's our first polling question. So we want to ask, crime victims with disabilities may not report to law enforcement for which of the following reasons? A, fear that they may not be understood. B, lack of support or confusion during the initial and follow-up investigation. And C, unable to obtain accommodations. And D, all of the above.
Okay, Dr. Hughes, back to you.
All right, thank you. Thanks everybody for doing that. So we know from a great deal of research that there are barriers to reporting that involve fears and concerns of people with disabilities. On this slide is a photo of a woman using a wheelchair and looking off into the distance. People with disabilities have reported concerns about retaliation by the offender and continued victimization. They've expressed fear of losing services if they were to report, services that are disability related or social services, loss of independence, loss of support, and this is particularly true for people who have offenders who are also serving as their caregivers. And if that person were to be removed from the home, that could leave them without support for essential activities of daily living, such as bathing or dressing. And then the other last concern is inclusion of disability in the public record. Fear that if the information were disclosed, that it could result in discrimination in housing, employment, and other major parts of their lives. Other barriers include beliefs and perceptions, such as futility. People will say, well, what's the use? There aren't any accommodations for us. The facilities, shelters, or whatever are not accessible. And what help will we get? What benefit will we receive by reporting crime to the police? And also they report that police lack training in interpersonal violence and often attribute the violence to a problem for medical providers or disability service providers. And then also the police lack training in disability. They lack the skills to communicate with people with disabilities and deaf people. For example, we've heard that people who are deaf people may be reaching for a paper and pencil to make notes to the officer, and the officer misinterpret that, thinking that they're reaching for a weapon, and act accordingly. Police also lack training in disability, and that is going to be mentioned over and over in our talk today, and it's something that the police want to receive. Other barriers to reporting: mobility or communication limitations. People with mobility limitations may not have access to a telephone or may not have access to their neighbor's home where they could go use a phone or get assistance with the reporting. People with disabilities experience extreme levels of social or physical isolation, and then also the lack of knowledge about the criminal justice system. Just how does it work? How does the reporting work? What happens with the investigation? What happens in the prosecution phase, etc. And so there is a need to have accessible information provided to people with disabilities so that they can increase their understanding of what will happen when they report their crime. Other barriers to reporting include shame and self-blame, even guilt for the victimization, reluctance to report family members or caregivers, and difficulty identifying behavior as abusive. For people who have experienced abuse throughout their lives, it becomes a normalized experience, and they may not label it as abuse. Here's our second polling question. Myths, stereotypes, and lack of knowledge can affect law enforcement contacts with people with disabilities. Which of the following is true? People with intellectual disabilities don't make good witnesses. Crime victims who take psychiatric medications are unable to assist in the prosecution of their case. More time may be necessary when interviewing a crime victim with a disability, or none of the above.
All right, Dr. Hughes, back to you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, everyone. All right, so on this slide is a photo of a man signing into the hand of a deaf blind man. Dr. Peter Celia and others have pointed out that police face multiple barriers to responding to crime victims with disabilities, including the identification of disability is difficult because they have not possibly had training to recognize that somebody has a disability, communication barriers, reluctance to share information. A person with disability, as we mentioned before, may be reluctant to share information that they have a disability or other information that could potentially harm them. And lack of knowledge, training, and experience on the part of police, and concern about witness credibility. The crime reporting study, as I mentioned before, we conducted the crime reporting study to identify barriers and facilitators to crime reporting by people with disabilities. It involved 2 qualitative studies asking similar questions of both crime victims and police. We asked questions about barriers and facilitators and several related questions. Who was involved? We conducted 2 focus group studies, a separate focus group study with people with disabilities that involved 52 people with disabilities, and 10 focus groups and 7 individual interviews were conducted for purposes of accommodation. The focus group study 2 was law enforcement officers, and there were 25 law enforcement officers who participated in one of 5 focus groups. And just so that you know that we wanted people who with disabilities who had actually reported their crime to the police. So these were crime victims with disabilities, crime survivors, if you will. And then law enforcement, we wanted law enforcement officers who had experience in working with crime victims with disabilities and or personal experience with disability either themselves or in their families. Where? In 2 northwestern states. So the findings from focus group 1 were published by Becky Child and al. In 2011, and the title was Understanding the Experience of Crime Victims with Disabilities and Deaf Victims, included in the references to this webinar. On this slide, we have a photo of a woman who is leaning over, looking very distressed, with her arms on her legs and one hand to her forehead, talking to someone who is taking notes or taking a report. So the key findings from our crime reporting study are listed here. These are themes, and we will go into some detail on each of these in the following slides. Disability identification and disclosure, victim understanding and involvement, credibility and victim blaming, misunderstandings and stereotypes, communication challenges, accommodations and support, intersectionality and history, and then overall recommendations by people with disabilities. Remember, this was the study that we're talking about here, is the study that we did with the focus groups with people with disabilities and deaf people. So the concerns of people were many, and particularly concerns of people with invisible disabilities, such as those with mental health disabilities or brain injury, deaf people or blind people. The people whose disabilities weren't readily visible reported not being understood, not receiving appropriate support, not being believed, and not being treated equitably following disclosure. May not even have heard what happened after the report, as other people would hear. Disability identification and disclosure involved other concerns, such as concerns about storing and retrieving disability information and collecting disability information from others. As this one person said, they talked to my caseworker. They talked to people at the nursing agency. They talked to my son. And I thought that was kind of invasive for somebody who was a victim. Victim understanding and involvement. People reported that they don't understand the reporting and investigation process, that they experience confusion over plea bargaining. And on this slide is a picture of a woman who is looking very distressed, holding her head in her hands and with her eyes closed. And in terms of plea bargaining, on this slide, we have a photo of a man holding a frying pan and apparently going to hit with it. And the quote is, "In the end, I said, how could you reduce these to high misdemeanors? He could have killed me. I felt that death was ready to come at me right at that moment. I could hear the clang, clang, clang as he banged me each time with a frying pan." Credibility and victim blaming. And on this slide, we have a photo of a person who is blind and holding a baby. And the quote is, "The first thing I asked was, what did you do to cause this?" And you know what I did? I was blind. And immediately being told, "We don't need to get any information from you because you can't identify the person." So people are stereotyped and are not, the police do not seem to have the skills to ask the kinds of questions that people who have visual impairment, people who are blind, can answer. You know, what did you smell? What did the person feel like? Those kinds of those kinds of questions that definitely could be answered and result in a full reporting. Misunderstanding and stereotypes. There's a photo on this slide of a man, looks like a man crawling through a window of a building, and a quote, "I'm a vet. I can say that when I go and make a complaint." Well, are you sure it's not Gulf War syndrome or some sort of post-traumatic stress syndrome? No, somebody is crawling through my window. And people with disabilities often tell us that they feel more like a criminal than a victim of crime when having these kinds of questions thrown at them. Communication challenges reported by people with crime victims with disabilities are that the officers talk too rapidly and they use language that is hard to understand. Quote, "They don't have a clue that they could lose you in just a couple of words. Before you get the chance to say anything, they interrupt you." And communication challenges, and this was a quote from a deaf crime victim. "I would suggest that when they would investigate my case, for example, they're willing to use email for me. But the DA, he said, he wouldn't communicate with me that way. So I didn't know that they had closed my case until 1 year later." And so again, asking for accommodations and being refused, and then not getting the information that is necessary. On this slide, we have photos of 5 people with differing disabilities and 1 criminal justice personnel person taking notes. And the accommodation and supports listed by people with disabilities are the need for use of their medication, for personal assistance, for clear language, for interpreters, accessible facilities, assistance with paperwork, and attention to communication needs. And out of all of those, the lack of interpreters was most consistently reported. Intersectionality in history. So intersectionality, we mean here, that, for example, the intersectionality between race and disability, or it could be any number of intersectionalities. So the treatment across multiple identities, what came up in many of the interviews, and basically people were saying that they would worry about being racially profiled. An African American woman said that she would be more concerned about reporting and being racially profiled than disclosing disability to the police, and she would prefer to go to her family, to disclose to her family. And then past experiences with law enforcement and hearing about treatment, brutality by police officers to other people in the disability community is a deterrent to reporting. On this slide, there's a photo of a man sitting in his wheelchair and just looking off thoughtfully. Okay, so let's see where we are now. So the recommendations by crime victims with disabilities were to establish a disability liaison. They were saying that could be with disability services, disability organizations, or social services, social worker, for example. Increase disability sensitivity training among the law enforcement officers. Arrange informal and formal interactions. You know, instead of just meeting the police, when having to do a crime report or some other process with criminal justice, having informal meetings in the community, maybe a class where they could mutually learn about each other's needs and experiences. And then assure accessible information. For example, somebody mentioned a brochure that would be available in alternate formats and distributed by the police to the disability community. All right, so I think that kind of ends my part, and I'm sorry my camera didn't work, but now I turn it over to Officer Sullivan, Sergeant Sullivan, for his part, and I believe he has the camera.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just clear one thing, I'm retired from Sullivan. I retired and I'm now doing ADA consulting. This part of the session is, I guess, Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story. So if you don't know who Paul Harvey is, I guess I just dated myself. First of all, I would like to apologize in advance to anyone who is signing or trying to keep up with me on captions. I talk fast, and it's a curse and a gift. So the part of this is the back side of the story, the other side of the story here. What I will be doing also is reading the quotes and talking about them a little bit. So this first one is a recognition of vulnerability of crime. These are quotes from the police officers and sheriffs who participated in the focus group. Because there are so many people that take advantage of everyone with a disability any way they can, whether it's stealing from them or living in the area or even being, abusive or violent with them. This is it. This officer recognized something, and one of the key things to point out as Rosemary was talking is this idea of recognition. So if you can recognize what's going on, that's a huge start. Other things that we learned from the officers were the difficulty in identifying with people with disabilities. People look at stereotypes. You think everybody, you mentioned in my trainings, I've asked how many people see the Rain Man. That may be their only impression of someone on the autism spectrum. So there's ideas of these preconceived notions about what people with disabilities look like or act like. Particular challenges of people with mental health disabilities. Obviously, there's a lot of CIT groups. That's a huge firm topic, hugely important. Legal and confidentiality issues. Officers I hear from are concerned about whether they can ask questions about disability because of the ADA or because of state laws or local laws or because of HIPAA. And Rosemary touched on this quite a bit already in communications difficulties, sign language interpreters, and alternate formatted materials. We also learned from officers about barriers to reporting and what to include in the police reports, knowing how much to include, discussions about disability. Again, this idea that you can't talk about disability. Should you put disability in police reports? Can it affect your case later? Kind of information listed. Not including adequate information. Hear from investigators that people, we'll talk a little bit later on that, that officers didn't tell them that the person, because of medication, shouldn't be called before, say, 10 or 11 in the morning. Things like that. Or also in officers not knowing if they take this report in that sort of stereotype, well, it's somebody with a disability, nobody's going to prosecute this, they're not believable or whatever, against myths and stereotypes. May impact on their reasons for taking or not taking the report initially. None of which are good, but that's the reality. Also, ideas what happens when if uncertain if the district attorney would take the case. Obviously, what happens to me, because I've been law enforcement, for the people that may not realize that. So you have a police officer or a sheriff's deputy arrives at your house. You take a report. It probably will go to an investigator, and then will present the case to the district attorney. And then the district attorney is going to decide they need more information, more of an investigation, or whether they're going to, can they prove this case beyond reasonable doubt. Also, then once in court, you have attorneys and judges that lack the training in disability and simple things of accommodation, sign language interpreters, allowing more time for someone to testify because of speech patterns or cognitive ability. All those sorts of things that are not usually seen in courts, because the judges and attorneys don't notice them or don't see them. And when they're there, they need to realize that this may have to change how they're operating the courtroom. Then there's the moral cost and worth to the victim. This idea comes up too later on. What about the victim? Are we going to run this victim again and re-traumatize them, or those kinds of things? So all these issues are sort of floating around out there. And all of the things I'm going to talk about can be overcome through training and information. We also talked about and learned from them about how effective interviews where the officers felt that they needed. This is an ongoing thing, having adequate time. The two big things that I keep seeing are time and communication. So you have adequate time. That's a policy issue. Establishing a rapport, getting in there and realizing when you're interviewing someone with a disability, you may take a longer period of time for them to get comfortable with you and for you to get comfortable with them. It's huge with any victim of any crime because, again, you're there, something terrible has happened. And having trained officers who can communicate with victims with disabilities. This is sort of the CIT model that's going on around the United States. But also, you need to realize that it's great to have officers trained. But I like the idea, since you have people with all disabilities across the board. You need to train everybody to understand this, and then we'll talk maybe a little bit later on about, say, for example, investigators and having more specialized training. And probably the key to everything, the hardest thing to learn, to do, is having patience. So some other things we learned from officers, what they felt was their view of people with disabilities about them, and was that they were designated as bad people. This idea that, and Rosemary talked about it, if someone has a bad experience with the police and you show up again, having nothing to do or any knowledge of whatever happened before, that's going to carry over to you. The problem with the policy of officer safety first, and then also down at the bottom, the last one, unintentional intimidation, kind of go hand in hand. And I'll kind of just talk a little, sort of a thing to help kind of focus that in. If you're going to do any training with law enforcement, you absolutely have to consider officer safety, because if I'm not safe, nobody's safe. But here's a way to look at it and how the perspective of officers, the unintentional intimidation, that's also something that's used to control. And then this other comment on the third bullet point here was the general fear of police. All this sort of flows in together, particularly for people who are deaf that are worried about being shot because they make a movement to, people and officers they're not responding to the officer's command. But let me get back to that officer safety concept. So every police officer, I was a training officer, every police officer has to learn it. It's called street smarts, officer safety, perception, whatever you want to call it. But what it comes down to is this. Every officer looks at somebody and they kind of have their own personal checklist, whether they're the good guy, the bad guy, the victim, the witness, the suspect, on drugs, not on drugs, drunk, sober, on parole, on probation, has a weapon, no weapon, sweating, agitated, moving their feet like they're going to run. All these things go on, and a police officer or deputy sheriff looks at that and makes an evaluation about this person in a thousandth of a second. They just size them up. My point is this. You can do officer safety because that's important, but when you're training, if you take a look at what officers are thinking in that moment, they have their little checklist, they fit their boxes. So then what you're looking at is behaviors. And when someone's behavior doesn't fit my box, I need to know, someone needs to tell me that behavior might be because of a disability. So then I have to change my approach to that person. I don't know if that makes sense. Anyway, there's another quote. So I'm going to read a series of quotes throughout this, just kind of they're great jumping off points. This is a picture with a person using a guide dog with a harness and a white cane. The quote is, "If we have someone with a disability, there's nothing here, period. It's just not available. It's never been given a thought, and it is needed." This is exactly where the Americans with Disabilities Act Title II fits in on program access. This is where policies and procedures come into play about providing service. Some of the lack of resources that were universally identified as barriers: fragmentation of services, lack of coordination, inaccurate information, continuously changing services. That's a problem in government at any rate, at any levels, but particularly when you're dealing with disabled victims of crimes or witnesses who are disabled. The system is very confused and can be daunting at times. Again, this is also a programming issue under the ADA. And there's a series of quotes here that I'm going to read from officers that really help kind of focus this down. This first quote from an officer is, "You're like, this person's drunk or dumb as a rock," and you blow them off and say, "Why don't you come on down? You don't know, stop drinking, come on down, and we'll take your report, and maybe it's not alcohol at all." It's not that they're stupid or blowing me off or not paying attention to me. It's that they have a disability. And that's what I was talking about a minute ago, that initial contact, my impression of a person. This is an officer going through his little checklist and decide, you know what, something's not fitting here. It's different than what usual. Maybe it's a disability. And then go from there. Another quote is, "What we've been through, some of these people have just been through the system a million times over with very little results. You go through some of the mental health system and welfare or SSI, and after a while, you come away disappointed. You don't have a lot of faith in the systems or the system in general, so you think, well, why bother? Is it going to help? Is it the same old, same old?" And this is that trust building, and we'll talk about community contacts at the end here. There's another quote. the photograph here, there's a pair of hands guiding us over a Braille printout. The person we're talking to is a victim of a crime, and maybe they don't feel comfortable communicating with us, or we don't have the skills to communicate with them. That goes back to that concept of rapport. Again, recognizing that there's some discomfort there and working with that person. We're saying something as simple as, you don't feel comfortable here. Is it me? Is there something I'm doing? Is it the way I'm speaking to you? You know, what is it? Tell me, what do you need? And that's an okay thing to do. It seems so obvious that sometimes focusing on getting the case done, particularly if it's a fresh crime just occurred, you're trying to get a description, trying to secure a crime scene. It's just maybe taking that few seconds to just say, you know, what is it? Tell me about it. Another quote from an officer: are the investigative techniques working with the disability community different from working with the rest of the community? And I say absolutely, absolutely. It's hugely different. This is the nail on the head. And we talked about it before. It's having the time, it's being able to communicate and realizing we may have to modify what we're doing in order to make this investigation work, to make the interview work, to make the follow-up work. All those things come together. There's another quote. Instead of asking someone to describe the guy, you can ask questions like, well, who does he remind you of? Well, he looks like Chachi from the Rodriguez family on TV. And you can get additional information by simply coming at it from a different approach. Again, this idea of modifying the normal way to go. Now, we know, and we've heard often about people with intellectual disabilities and other cognitive impairments, is asking open-ended questions. So, things like during your interviews is you get into this idea, we have a lot of jargon. What's a suspect look like? You might just say, tell me what happened, which allows the person to tell a story. And obviously, there's going to be bits and pieces where you need to refocus because of the investigative needs, elements of crime, and things like that. So what you do, my feeling is, instead of saying, can you describe the person to me, to say, tell me what he looked like. What was he wearing? Just keep it open, allow him to tell the story, maybe even taking him back to where the crime occurred and have him stand there and relay the story, because that might help jog their memory as they see background things that might remember where the guy came from, or who else may have been on the street. Was the store owner standing in the window of the store, is the cash register of the local shop right in the line of sight of where the crime occurred? Things like that. Avoid police jargon. Another one, it was mentioned earlier about a blind victim. Something as simple as taking them back and having them walk through the crime scene. Of course, that's assuming there are no crime scene contamination issues or whatever going on. For example, a first match. Someone follows their path every day to work. They know their path. You walk them back through and they may tell you something like, when I got here, I heard rustling behind me. Well, you're standing there and you're looking at, there's a big dumpster in the beginning of an alleyway. And they describe the sounds that they heard. Well, now you figure out that maybe the guy's standing behind the dumpster, or there are cameras around. Again, back to the shopkeeper, other people on the street. Did UPS just deliver to the store and walk right by the guy who was running away and the driver's gone now because he didn't know that he didn't see anything or saw something? So those are kind of simple things, not to what happened in that earlier quote where the victim was just pissed off. The criminal justice system is confusing. It's confusing to everyone unless you're deeply involved in it. One thing that clearly happens with our disabled community is the prosecutorial process is so slow. By the time it gets to court, many times those caregivers are gone because they're making $3.75 an hour. They don't hang around for the 18 months it takes to get to trial, and they're gone. And the witnesses are gone. And it's a terrible problem we have, specifically in the prosecutorial end. So Rosemary mentioned early on about someone having their case dismissed without them knowing about or being plea-bargained. Again, this is up to the investigators, police officers, district attorney investigators, victim witness programs that assist victims, the nonprofits they may be working with, to understand the system and to make sure there's communication going. Just that emails, however it works, but just to make sure that people are kept abreast of what's going on with their cases. Another quote is on barriers to interviewing. But the key on these investigations is time. I know that patrol officers feel like I've got to get this call done and move on. And at some point, the administration is going to have to realize that if you get one of these calls, you're going to be tied up for a long time. there's this constant theme of time. Time on the part of people with disabilities that they didn't feel the officers spent enough time, and the officers with time, trying to handle calls for service, backed up runs, things that need to happen. So this is a policy issue. Departments, agencies just need to realize that if you have a call involving a person with disability, it is going to take longer. And you just have to have that realization and act accordingly. Other solutions. So we have some solutions that were suggested by officers. Specialty unit with disability trained investigators. Good idea, particularly the investigators that are doing the follow-up, because they're going to spend a lot more time with the victims and doing interrogations and interviews, follow-ups, taking statements, understanding that someone who's deaf who may be writing a statement, the grammar may not seem appropriate, standardized grammar. It's because they're writing an ASL and it doesn't mean anything about their intellect. So investigators have a higher level of training, but the general disability training at the academy is for everyone to understand it, so that everyone from the officer handling an initial case understands he has a person with disabilities, recognizes the issues that need to happen there, maybe calling the investigators early on, but understanding they have to do something a little bit different. And then the last one here, which I think every employer in the United States probably dreams about, is hiring people with common sense. I don't know how to fix that one. The second set of solutions offered were, again, time. Need adequate time, but is realistically unattainable. That's a policy and procedure issue that can be overcome. Community partnerships, huge. Going out and talking to independent living centers, nonprofits that are providing services to people with disabilities, different disability groups. There were several in San Francisco as a community liaison for the department, dealt with the UC Center on Deafness, self-help for the hard of hearing, a lot of them. The other trick on that is talking to them as they're providing services to their clients, that they understand when crimes have been committed. For example, there was a gentleman who was deaf, had his laptop stolen. Several months later, he had not reported it. Several months later, he was a victim of identity theft, went to his nonprofit that worked with people who were deaf, and had them cancel their, called the bank for them, took care of all that stuff, got it all set up. Fortunately, the person called me and said, should we do something about this? And the answer is yes, make a report. They need to do a police report. Had he done a police report at the front end, he might not have turned in an identity theft case. But the bottom line there is getting the service providers to recognize when crimes have been committed and to call us, call the sheriff or the police department to come in and make a report. Informal interaction with disability community policing's out there, going to meetings, just stopping in on the beats or sectors, disability groups, Golden Gate Regional Center in San Francisco, used to stop in and out there all the time. They provided services. And also just increasing familiarity with community resources, so officers know who to call and get a question answered. This is another quote. Again, the time thing, so it makes it difficult because we want to help. We're the underdog. We want to take care of people. We only have a limited amount of time. Time is the key barrier to investigation. Wasted time and time to conduct thorough investigations. That's just an ongoing problem, but I do believe it can be done. Let me skip ahead here to the polling question. Law enforcement training regarding disability issues should not include which of the following: an overview of the types of disability, information about the ADA and other anti-discrimination laws, diagnostic criteria for the evaluation of disability, inclusion of people with disability in development of training. All right. Moving right along, because we're a little short on time. Another quote about training: it's not realistic that you can train up officers to reach high levels of being able to deal with a whole bunch of disabilities. In reality, that should be like trying to train officers to speak 100 different languages or something. Another suggestion was, let's say you've got some officers that are specially trained in interviewing disabled people or some sort of skills like that. Maybe by policy, make it so that they come in, they deal with the disabled victim, but the primary officer is still responsible for processing the scene, gathering the evidence, interviewing potential witnesses, or perhaps identifying the officers coming to assist them. Same idea, to train everybody to one level of recognition and then, specialized investigators to a higher level if need be. So recommendations. Researchers, law enforcement officials, and disability advocates should work together to develop and test efficient, effective, and realistic ways of closing the gaps between these two groups. They should offer relevant and useful information on interacting effectively with people with diverse disabilities. Likewise, disability groups should receive appropriate information on relating to law enforcement. Common efforts at all should be made to provide social educational opportunities for people with disabilities and law enforcement officials outside of crime-related situations. And just let me kind of end with this. We talked about sensitivity training. My thing about sensitivity training is, people view that as, you have people without disabilities sit in a wheelchair, walk around a classroom, try to go through the door, it doesn't work. They get up, hand the chair off to the next person, and say, oh, that's really tough. I like the idea of awareness training. If you're made aware of something, that means you're educated. And if you're educated, that means you have a responsibility to do something about that. And again, if you're focusing in the training on not being diagnostic, not being a medical model, if you go the diagnostic medical model, you take autism, you think of the DSM and now the DSM-5 with the new definitions on the spectrum, then if you're teaching a medical model, then you're locked into a diagnosis, and when you diagnosis, your diagnosis may be wrong. Well, if you don't find out it's wrong until later, in a medical profession, it has an impact. In a law enforcement setting, that has an impact also. If you focus on behavior and learn to recognize some general information about disabilities and what officers come in contact with, then what you can do is realize that you're seeing different behaviors and realize that it may be a disability. Ask those questions and find out, and then modify your approach accordingly. So the bottom line in all this, in my view, is plan with, not for. And I will now turn it back to Catherine.
First of all, thank you to Dr. Hughes and Sgt. Sullivan for a great presentation. Here in a minute, I'm going to start calling on people with questions or reading them from the Q&A section, so be ready to raise your hand if you have a question. If your question isn't answered during this webinar, or if you have additional questions, you can send it to nccjdinfo@thearc.org, and we'll be delighted to work with you directly. Let's see, we got it on a slide here somewhere. Here we go. Also, after the webinar, we have a short survey for you to fill out and a link to register for the May webinar. You may have to copy and paste it into your browser if you're not able to click on it directly. In May, we'll welcome Shirley Paisley, who will present Using Model Protocols to Guide Criminal Justice Response to Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Victims with Disabilities. Don't forget to register. If registration fails, we're working on a waitlist process, and worst case, you can always watch the archived copy of the webinar on our website 2 to 5 days after the live event. All right, so who has questions? All right, I've got one here from Karen, and I apologize if I get your last name wrong, Spakianakis. And she would like to know more about how the police are allowed to close a case without any notification to the victim. And don't forget to unmute yourself, presenters. There we go.
It's going to vary jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but basically what happens is once the case is brought to the district attorney's office, they're looking at prosecution. So they may not be able to prove a case in court, and they get dismissed for lack of evidence or needing to follow through. And that's something you can check with each of your local agencies, whether it's police or sheriff's department, and find out what those criteria are. And that's typically is the district attorney's discretion to prosecute.
Great, thank you. We've got one from Christy Ward. How do we reduce public fear of people with disabilities? If we need them as partners, how can we help them understand enough to be a natural support? So maybe Dr. Hughes, if you want to weigh in on this one.
Yeah, this is Rosemary. I think that we talked about the possibilities of decreasing fear and intimidation of police by people with disabilities, and one that definitely calls on the law enforcement officers to behave in such a way in media that the intimidation or the bullying by police would be eliminated, so the fear would be less. And also, as we mentioned before, having informal contacts with one another, as Michael mentioned in his presentation. Does that help?
Yeah, all right. And one more here. What is the role of culture in reporting crime, and has that been incorporated into the research?
This is Rosemary. The role of culture has been incorporated into the research, particularly around deaf culture, and that's really a big one because that's often eliminated and overlooked in this type of research. And I think also the the fact that we do collect information about culture, at least about minority cultures, and report back accordingly. But as far as the culture, mostly I believe we have incorporated people from different racial, different sexual minority groups, different disability groups into the development and implementation and evaluation of our research.
And Catherine, can I go back just a second to that previous question?
Absolutely.
Just something, we talk about fears. There's fears on both sides. People bring to the table their own experiences. This is a very sophisticated group listening to this, but I have had an officer say to me one time, was talking about a person with autism, saying, well, they get agitated and they're really strong. And it's one of those things where you think, wow, really? But if no one's ever told that officer the contrary, then his view of the world is that he heard somewhere along the way that people with, autism, on the autism spectrum or intellectual disabilities are really strong. So there's an idea that it's a two-way street. There's a lot of stereotyping going on both sides, is to break that down.
All right, thank you. I'm seeing a couple of other questions that are more about resources and where to find information. So we'll be sure to follow up with anyone after with where to find. And there's a references page as well that you'll be able to see on the website. So I'm kind of sticking right now to some more substantive kinds of questions while we've got our experts on the line. So Christy Ward, regarding deaf victims, can police officers carry a simple card linked to a belt with emergency signs or symbols to know the type of distress the person experienced? And Christy, I think that's a great question beyond just the deaf community.
One of the continuing things we kept seeing is communications, having sign language interpreters available 24/7. Simple signs, there are a lot of cards and things out there for officers, with icons. There's different kind of communications devices. Those are available, they're all good ideas. And this, again, I talked about the Americans with Disabilities Act, but this is Title II and this is program access. These are the kinds of things you can look to solutions, and this is the perfect opportunity to plan with the community, to talk to groups to find out what's going to work best for them. And training, and policy, and procedure. You got to lock those together.
All right, thank you. Does anybody else have questions? You can also raise your hand and ask it out loud if you don't want to type it in. All right, do our presenters have anything else for us before we finish up here?
I would just like to say, if you haven't thought about contacting your department, I talked about a community liaison or liaison. I performed that function for 17 years in the San Francisco Police Department. One thing you can do if you don't know where to start to make that approach, talk to the chief of police, talk to the sheriff, or find out if you're in a county or city, who is your county or city ADA coordinator, because that's someone that you can make contact with to get this thing started.
Yeah, and this is Rosemary. I just wanted to say, too, in terms of law enforcement contacting people with disability expertise, in most communities, there will be a Center for Independent Living that is a resource center and a source of all types of information on interacting, just, you know, getting to know people with disabilities and accessing resources through those centers. I also just want to say thank you to everybody for your wonderful participation and giving us the opportunity to visit with you today.
Great, thank you. And that's the end of our program for today. And real fast, Carolyn Demetria just pointed out that I should let you guys know there is a Senate hearing next week. It's law enforcement responses to disabled Americans, promising approaches for protecting public safety. And that's on April 29th at 10 a.m. at the Dirksen Senate Office Building here in DC. But if you cannot attend, you can also submit written testimony by the end of the day on Monday. And if you want any more information about that, feel free to email us and we'll get you moving, because they need to hear what everyone has to say. So thank you everyone for attending, and we'll be sure to follow up with those of you that have asked for more information. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.